Hello. Today we are picking up on the bottom of page 27, Mitch Albom's The Five People You Meet in Heaven. We will be making a book, brain, or a heart connection today, and I will actually save that connection for the end. And I invite you to think about something that resonates with you, something that is affecting you in some way as we read today. Eddie blinked hard. This was the ruby pier of his childhood some 75 years ago, only everything was new, freshly scrubbed. Over there was the loop ride, which had been torn down decades ago. And over there the bathhouses and the saltwater swimming pools that had been raised in the 1950s. Over there, jutting into the sky, was the original Ferris wheel in its pristine white paint. And beyond that, the streets of his old neighborhood and the rooftops of the crowded brick tenements with laundry lines hanging from the windows. Eddie tried to yell, but his voice was raspy air. He mouthed a "Hey!" but nothing came from his throat. He grabbed his arms and legs. Aside from his lack of voice, he felt incredible. He walked in a circle. He jumped, no pain. In the last 10 years, he had forgotten what it was like to walk without wincing or sit without struggling to find comfort for his lower back. On the outside, he looked the same as he had that morning. A squat, barrel-chested old man in a cap and shorts and a brown maintenance jersey. But he was limber. So limber, in fact, he could touch behind his ankles and raise a leg to his belly. He explored his body like an infant, fascinated by the new mechanics, a rubber man doing a rubber man stretch. Then he ran. Ha! Running! Eddie had not truly run in more than 60 years. Not since the war, but he was running now, starting with a few gingerly steps, then accelerated into a full gait, faster, faster, like the running boy of his youth. He ran along the boardwalk, past a bait and tackle stand for fishermen, 5 cents, and a bathing suit stand, rental stand for swimmers, 3 cents. He ran past a chute ride called the Dipsy Doodle. He ran past the Ruby Pier Promenade, beneath the magnificent buildings of Moorish design, with spires and minarets and onion-shaped domes. He ran past the Parisian Carousel, with its carved wooden horses, glass mirrors, Wurlitzer organ, all shiny and new. Only an hour ago it seemed he had been scraping rust from its pieces in his shop. He ran down the heart of the old Midway where the weight guessers, fortune tellers, and dancing gypsies had once worked. He lowered his chin and held his arms out like a glider. In every few steps he would jump, the way children do, hoping running will turn to flying. It might have seemed ridiculous to anyone watching, this white-haired maintenance worker all alone making an airplane, but the running boy is inside every man, no matter how old he gets. And then Eddie stopped running. He heard something, a voice. Tinny, as if coming through a megaphone. "How about him, ladies and gentlemen? Have you ever seen such a horrible sight?" Eddie was standing by an empty ticket kiosk in front of a large theater, and the sign above read, "The World's Most Curious Citizens, Ruby Pier's Sideshow." Holy smoke, they're fat, they're skinny. See the wild man. The slideshow, the freak house, the ballyhoo hall. Eddie recalled them shutting this down at least 50 years ago. About the time television became popular and people didn't need sideshows to tickle their imagination. Look well upon this savage, born into the most peculiar handicap. Eddie peered into the entrance. He had encountered some odd people here. There was Jolly Jane, who weighed over 500 pounds and needed 2 men to push her up the stairs, conjoined twin sisters who shared a spine and played musical instruments. There were men who swallowed swords and women with beards and a pair of Indian brothers whose skin went rubbery from being stretched and soaked in oils until it hung in bunches from their limbs. Eddie, as a child, had felt sorry for the sideshow cast. They were forced to sit in booths or on stages, sometimes behind bars as patrons walked past them, leering and pointing. Oh, a barker would ballyhoo at the oddity. It was a barker's voice that Eddie heard now. Only a terrible twist of fate could leave a man in such a pitiful condition. From the farthest corner of the world, we have brought him for your examination. Eddie entered the darkened hall, and the voice grew louder. This tragic soul has endured a perversion of nature. It was coming from the other side of the stage. Only here at the world's most curious citizens can you draw this near. Eddie pulled aside the curtain. Feast your eyes upon the most unspeakable. The barker's voice vanished, and Eddie stepped back in disbelief. There, sitting in a chair, alone on the stage, was a middle-aged man with a narrow, stooped shoulder. Naked from the waist up, his belly sagged over his belt. His hair was closely cropped. His lips were thin, and his face was long and drawn. Eddie would have long since forgotten him were it not for one distinctive feature. His skin was blue. Hello, Edward, he said. I have been waiting for you. Page 32, the first person Eddie meets in heaven. Don't be afraid, the blue man said, rising slowly from his chair. Don't be afraid. His voice was soothing, but Eddie could only stare. He had barely known this man. Why was he seeing him now? He was like one of those faces that pops onto your dreams, and the next morning you say, You'll never guess who I dreamed about last night. Your body feels like a child's, right? Eddie nodded. You were a child when you knew me, that's why. You start with the same feelings you had. Start what? Eddie thought. The blue man lifted his chin. His skin was grotesque shade, a graying blueberry. His fingers were wrinkled. He walked outside, and Eddie followed. The pier was empty. The beach was empty. Was the entire planet empty? Tell me something, the blue man said, and he pointed to two humped wooden roller coasters in the distance. The Whipper. It was built in the 1920s before under-friction wheels, meaning the cars couldn't turn very quickly, unless you wanted them launching off the track. The Whipper. Is it still the fastest ride on Earth? Eddie looked at the old clanking thing, which had been torn down years ago, and he shook his head. Ah, the blue man said. I imagined as much. Things don't change here. And there's none of that peering down from the clouds, I'm afraid. Here? Eddie thought. The blue man smiled as if he'd heard the question. He touched Eddie's shoulder, and Eddie felt a surge of warmth. Oh, unlike anything he'd ever felt before, and his thoughts came spilling out like sentences. How'd I die? Oh, an accident. How long have I been dead? A minute? An hour? 1,000 years. Where am I? The blue man pursed his lips and then repeated the question thoughtfully. Where are you? He turned and raised his arms. All at once, the rides at the old Ruby Pier cranked to life, and the Ferris wheel spun, and the Dodgem cars smacked into each other. The Whipper clacked uphill, and the Parisian carousel horses bobbed on their brass poles. The cheery music of the Wurlitzer organ. The ocean was in front of them. The sky was the color of lemons. Where do you think? The blue man asked. Heaven. Heaven. No! No! Eddie shook his head violently, and the blue man seemed amused. No, it can't be heaven. Why? Because this is where you grew up. Eddie mouthed the words. Ah. Well, people often belittle the place when they're born, but heaven can be found in the most unlikely corners, and heaven itself has many steps. This for me is the second, and for you, the first. He led Eddie through the park, passing cigar shops and sausage stands and the flat joints where suckers lost their nickels and dimes. Heaven? Eddie thought. Ridiculous. He had spent most of his adult life trying to get away from Ruby Pier. It was an amusement park, that's all, a place to scream and get wet and trade your dollars for Cupid dolls, and the thought that this was some kind of blessed resting place was beyond his imagination. He tried again to speak, and this time he heard a small grunt from his chest. And the blue man turned. Your voice will come. We all go through the same thing. You cannot talk when you first arrive. He smiled. It helps you listen. There are 5 people you meet in heaven, the blue man suddenly said. Each of us was in your life for a reason. You may not have known the reason at the time, and that is what heaven is for understanding your life on earth. Eddie looked confused. People think of heaven as a paradise garden, a place where they can float on clouds and lakes and rivers and mountains, but scenery without solace is meaningless. This is the greatest gift of God can give you, to understand what happened in your life, to have it explained. It is the peace you have been searching for. Eddie coughed. He was tired of being silent. I'm your first person, Edward. When I died, my life was illuminated by 5 others, and then I came here to wait for you, to stand in your line, to tell you my story, which becomes part of yours. And there will be others for you, too. Some you knew, maybe some you didn't, but they all crossed your path before they died, and they altered it forever. Eddie pushed up a sound from his chest. What? He finally croaked. His voice seemed to be breaking through a shell, like a baby chick. What killed? The blue man waited patiently. What killed you? The blue man looked a bit surprised. He smiled at Eddie. Oops, I gotta reverse the way this is written. It's the blue man. It's Eddie that says to the blue man, What killed you? And the blue man looked a bit surprised after Eddie asked that question, and he smiled at Eddie, and he said, You did. So here, if you stop and you make a connection, and then we'll come back. So if I was to take some notes here on the book, what I would know is the setting now is heaven. The blue man is Eddie's first person he meets in heaven, and apparently Eddie killed the blue man. And now we need to find out how. That's my big question right now. How did Eddie kill the blue man? So I'm going to read, try to get through one more page or 2. Today is Eddie's birthday. He's 7 years old, and his gift is a new baseball. He squeezes it in each hand, feeling a surge of power that runs up his arms. He imagines he's one of his heroes on the Cracker Jack collector cards, maybe the great pitcher, Walter Johnson. Here, toss it, his brother Joe says. They are running along the midway past the game booth where, if you knock over 3 green bottles, you win a coconut and a straw. Come on, Eddie, Joe says. Share. Eddie stops and imagines himself in a stadium. He throws the ball, and his brother pulls in his elbows and ducks. Too hard, Joe yells. My ball, Eddie screams. Dang you, Joe. Eddie watches it thump down the boardwalk and bang off a post into a small clearing behind the sideshow tents. He runs after it, and Joe follows, and they drop to the ground. You see it? Eddie says. A whumping noise interrupts them. A tent flaps open, and Eddie and Joe look up, and there's a grossly fat woman and a shirtless man with reddish hair covering his entire body. Freaks from the freak show. And the children freeze. What are you wise asses doing back here? The hairy man says, grinning. Looking for trouble? Joe's lip trembles. He starts to cry, and he jumps up and runs away, and his arms pumping wildly, and Eddie rises too, and then he sees his ball against a sawhorse. He eyes the shirtless man and moves slowly toward it. This is mine, he mumbles, and he scoops up the ball, and he runs after his brother. And we'll stop there. I look forward to reading to you again. Thanks for joining me on Miss Clark Reads to You.